Yeah, all right. So a very good evening to everybody. What I want to do today is basically two things. One is I want to discuss the philosophy behind why doing research in an ethical manner is very important. So, what is the fundamental philosophy? And then, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about how to navigate the IRB process here. So, once you have your research formalized and you're ready to go, you want to start collecting data, what should you do? How should you navigate the IRB process? Okay, and what are the things that you should keep in mind? Okay, so those are the two things that I want to talk about. So beginning with the first one, uh, ethics. So research has been done since beginning of, I don't know, time, I would say, right? But if you think about it, the way research was done, and I want to talk about some very notable historical research studies, right? So, for example, the Tuskegee study, which was about uh, syphilis. So, in that experiment, basically, the researchers wanted to know how syphilis affected human body, and the purpose is very noble. It's very important to know the answer to that kind of a question. But the method that was used, basically the researchers to understand how syphilis affected human body, the researchers left some of the humans untreated. For those who were affected with syphilis, they were left untreated while others were treated. So kind of have a control group right there. So that was one study that is a notable one in history. Milgram study. This one is a very common one. Are you aware of that at all? Okay, so Milgram is he was a professor at Yale University, and he was trying to understand why people obey to others, even if they are not authoritative figures in their lives. Why do people obey others? And what he did in his experiment was that he called in a bunch of people, and he made the participants believe that they were administering an electric shock to other people. In reality, that was not the case. He just made them believe that they were doing that. And then you might be very familiar with some of the famous Nazi experiments, right, where they were basically releasing all types of poisonous gases and whatnot in their concentration camps. So there were a lot of practices or practices done in the name of research, right? I mean, the goal of all these studies was to advance knowledge. But the question is, we are advancing knowledge, but at what cost, right? So, because of all those kind of experiments, there was a national commission set up, which is basically a group of concerned researchers who came together and they said, okay, this kind of research work has to stop, or maybe there's a better way of doing this kind of research work, right? So the group, what they did is they published a Belmont report, which was later adopted by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And basically all research now is regulated by Health and Human Service Department. So what was in the Belmont report? So the Belmont report laid out basically three main principles that when you're doing research, these three principles need to be followed or respected, all right? So the first one is respect for people participating in your research. Basically, you need to treat them as autonomous agents, meaning they have the decision-making power to decide whether to participate in your study or not participate in your study. And they shouldn't be coerced in any manner. So when you're talking about coercion, it's not like just physical coercion. It could be psychological manipulation or any kind of cheating, right, to make the participant be a part of your study should not happen, basically. Okay. Beneficence. This is basically research is done to advance knowledge. And in the process of doing research, we have to constantly look at what the risk to the participant is versus what the benefit to the participant is. And basically the research is justified if the benefit outweighs the risk. Okay, so that is another principle that researchers should keep in mind. And then the third one is about justice. So it's about the fact that when you're doing research, and sometimes risks are involved, and sometimes both. It's not only that participants get benefits, risks are also involved. But regardless of these risks or these benefits, everybody should be, the risk and the benefit should be equal to all. It shouldn't be that one group in the research is experiencing all the risk versus the other one is experiencing all the benefit. It should be equally distributed. Okay, so these are the three main fundamental principles that were laid out in the Belmont report. And then the US Department, so based on those three principles, the US Department of Health and Human Service, HHS, they came up with a set of regulations called 45 CFR 46. And this regulation has, I think, 6 or 7 parts. And the first part is known as the Common Rule. But it got revised recently in 2019. So that's why it's now called the Revised Common Rule. And the Revised Common Rule applies to basically regular research. The other parts of the regulation apply to special populations like prisoners or mothers or so. That's focused regulation for other groups. But subpart A is called the Common Rule, which is basically the regulations that is governing all human subject research in general. And these are the regulations that FIT has decided to adopt, as well as more than 20 federal agencies all across US, including NSF, NIH, they all adopt these. So what do these regulations do? Basically, these regulations provide us with a guideline and a set of tools, techniques, and guidelines to ensure that we do our research ethically. All right? When I say ethically, basically I'm saying that all those 3 principles of the Belmont report are satisfied. Okay? And we are doing that in a bunch of different ways that I'll talk about. So before I go into that, I want to talk about what constitutes human subject research. Okay, because when I'm reviewing sometimes applications or protocols, IRB protocols, people think that their research constitutes as human subject research, but in reality it does not. So if it doesn't constitute as human subject research as per to the definition, then really you don't need to go through the IRB process. So it's very important to understand when is your research classified as human subject research, because you could basically avoid that whole process in the event your research doesn't. All right, so definition of research. It is a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop. So it's a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Okay, so what I've highlighted here in red is what you need to understand. First is that it's a systematic investigation. It can, sometimes you start on a project and then you realize, oh, this project has a potential for publishing the results, and so you think it's a research, but in reality it's not a research because it was not a systematic investigation, meaning that you didn't follow a protocol in place, a methodology in place, right? So you didn't have your research design or the research methodology identified earlier. Okay, so in those cases, those are kind of exploratory studies, right? That doesn't classify as those. And second is generalizable knowledge, meaning that your research should contribute to generating knowledge that the society at large can benefit from. Okay, so those are the two things. So some scholarly activities like biography, oral history, historical scholarship, they do not constitute as research. So something like if you are writing a biography on someone, right, it will not be constituted as research because although in the process of writing that person's biography, you are conducting research, meaning you're collecting information from various sources, it still does not constitute as research because whatever research or information you gathered, you cannot generalize it to anybody else except that person who you're collecting the research about, right? So it's not generalizable knowledge, okay? All right, so, okay, the form, I meant this one as a in-class quiz. If I had the PowerPoints open up, then I would have, this was the real answer, so I was kind of just going to show you the question and then let you answer and then show you the correct answer. But now that it's a PDF format, so the answer is right there, right? But okay, try not to look at the answer, but look at this one. The university library staff is systematically conducting a survey of members of an academic unit to find out if the library is meeting the department's needs. Is this research? So this is not research in this case. Why?
Because it's not general to everyone.
Yeah, because it's only about that particular department's needs. So whatever you find out from your research cannot be generalized beyond that particular department. If it was something that you're collecting and analyzing for the benefit of libraries all around in general, then that would classify as research, right? But if it's just for some particular department, then no, because it's not generalizable beyond that particular department, right? Another one. Okay, I'll keep this one right here, right? Okay. A historical study about the rights of a specific civil leader. Is this research? Why?
It's very similar to
Specific.
Yeah, it's too specific, right? It's kind of the same as like an autobiographic example because you cannot, whatever knowledge that is generated, it's just about that one person, right? So it is not research. Okay, what about this one? A study about the societal impacts of the civil rights movement driven by a specific leader. Why?
Because if you're collecting information on societal impact, it's probably going to be applied to the entire society.
Society at large, right? So now that becomes research. Are you with me, everybody? Right? So I'm glad you guys are getting this. Okay. So finding out whether your research satisfies the definition of human subject research involves two parts. One is knowing, first of all, if it's research, right? Now, if it is not research, then you don't need IRB, right? But if it is research, the next question you need to ask is it human subject research? All right? And you would think that would be a very straightforward question, but it's actually not. Okay? So how does HHS define human subject? It has to be a living individual about whom an investigator, one, obtains information or biospecimen. When we're talking about biospecimen, we are talking about things like blood, hair, urine sample, things like that. Okay? Through intervention or interaction with the individual, and uses, studies, or analyzes the information, or obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimen. Okay? Now there is a small caveat to this, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But before I talk about that, let's see what those terms highlighted in red mean. So first of all, it has to be a living individual, right? Sometimes your research may involve people who are dead. In that case, it would not constitute as human subject. Next, it's about whom kind of questions. So you're asking things like people's emotions or people's perceptions towards something or people's behavior or things like that. Those are the kind of about whom kind of questions, all right? And you're collecting data either through intervention or interaction. So intervention is basically something like where the researcher is intervening in the research design in some way. So be it, for example, in a behavioral manner, like when you're conducting an experiment and you're subjecting, you tell something to the control group, you say something else, or you treat them as, you give them different treatments. So that could be an intervention. It could be even physical. You're physically intervening, meaning, for example, when you're measuring someone's brain activity, right? That's an example of physical intervention. Or you could be interacting with the research participants, and this could be, interacting could be both active or passive. So active could be like interviewing someone, but passive could be just like observing someone, right? So for example, people interacting with some kind of technology, right? So you can have the research participants in a room where you're observing from a next room how they are interacting with technology. So that's kind of a passive observation, right? And then lastly, it has to be generating identifiable information. So in the process of collecting data, when you're collecting the data, is that data, can you tie that data back to a person? So if you can do that, then you are generating identifiable information, meaning you are kind of revealing the identity of that person, right? So in this case, if all those things are satisfied, then it's human subject, okay? Now, so I was talking about a caveat earlier. There's a lot of research at FIT where we are not generating identifiable information. Everything is anonymous, right? So those kind of research falls under the exempt category, okay? Now when I say exempt, it does not mean you are exempt from IRB. What it means is that you still have to submit your application to IRB, but it's just exempt from those federal regulations. So from those, whatever, all the regulations that have been defined by the revised common rule, it's just exempt from that, okay? So there's a misunderstanding sometimes. In fact, when I took this role up as a chair, I used to think that exempt means not, no need to submit an IRB protocol. But it was a learning curve. So I learned that that's not what it means, okay? All right, so here's a quiz now. A researcher calls the director of a shelter for battered women and asks her for the average length of stay of women who use the shelter. Is this research?
No.
No. Why?
It's not identifiable private information that's being collected. The interaction.
It should be research. Why?
Maybe it has a broader impact.
So you're right. Okay. So it is not research. Okay. I mean, sorry. Is this what I meant was? Is this human subject research? Okay. Human subject. Sorry. What I meant was, is this human subject research? And it's actually not, because it's not about a whom kind of question, right? It's about a what kind of question. Look at this. The researcher wants to find out the average length of stay of women, right? That's not a whom kind of question. That's a what kind of question. Like, how long are the average the women staying, right? Now, if the researcher interviewed the director about her training experience, how she defines the problem of battering, you see, all those now become about whom kind of questions. Now you're getting into the experience, the emotions, the perceptions of someone related to battering of women, right? Versus here, all we are doing is average length of stay, right? That is not, there is no human component to it. Make sense? All right? So that is why it would not be considered as human subject. Make sense? Okay. All right. So, given all that, what happens if we don't conduct research properly? All right. What I basically mean, what are the consequences of not going through the IRB? Okay. Now, FIT IRB is meant to help you in ensuring that your research is aligned with the federal regulation. So we are complying by everything properly, right? If that is not done properly, then you can see the consequences are on a scale of mild to severe, right? Where you could be immediate shutdown of all research at an organization, right? So there can be very dire consequences. The good news is that nothing of this kind has ever happened here. All right, at least from the much that I know. Okay, so we're good. I mean, there are many times I have to work with people submitting their applications, where I kind of give them their application back and I tell them, okay, revise this. But there has never been a time where I've disproved of any study. Okay, so that's what I meant. The role of FIT IRB is just to kind of help you make sure that you are in alignment with all the ethical principles and the regulations. Okay, so, but I still like to put this slide up because it just shows people that this is serious stuff. You know, it shouldn't be something that should be ignored. Okay. All right. So given all that, now how do we navigate the IRB review process? Okay. So once you've designed your research, once you are set, you have your research question in place, you know how you're going to collect your data and everything, you have everything set up. Now you are getting ready to collect data. So IRB application should be made before you start collecting data. Okay, but you need to have all those components of your research in place. Okay, so when you get started, when you're getting ready to fill out the IRB forms, you can go to the IRB website on fit.edu, That's the link there. And you'll find all the forms and all the instructions and things to take into consideration and everything, all the material that you need uploaded. Okay. When you go to forms, you will see that there are 5 different kinds of forms: exempt, expedited or full, renew, revision, and adverse event reporting. So let me just quickly go through when you would use which form. Okay. All right. So exempt, you would use exempt when your research participants are anonymous and there is basically no risk to them. That's when you use exempt. Now, exempt means, once again, it does not mean that you don't need an IRB application. All it means is that you are exempt from the word-to-word compliance of federal regulations. Okay, so IRB is still going to look at your exempt application, and we are going to make sure whether if you say it's exempt, meaning then IRB makes the decision of whether it's really no risk to participants or is it really anonymous. So if those two conditions are satisfied, then your exempt application is pretty much approved, given you have all the right controls in place, right? Okay. So sometimes you may think that your research classifies as exempt, but IRB may not. So in that case, even if IRB basically makes the decision of whether your research is really exempt or not. So you may fill out an exempt protocol, and when you submit it to IRB, IRB thinks, okay, this is not exempt, it should be expedited. In that case, we will follow the expedited process for your approval. Okay. All kind of research that involves children, so anybody below 18 or with impaired decision-making capabilities, so someone with disabilities, like the Oscott Center for Autism does a lot of that kind of research. All that kind of research is never exempt. Okay, it's always expedited. What kind of research do you guys do though? Yeah.
I had to fill out the full one, not the exempt one, because I worked with high school students.
Okay, so that makes sense, yeah. All right. Now with the expedited, many times you're also collecting data from another institution, like it could be a university or a hospital or a clinic or whatever. In that case, you also have to obtain a site approval, meaning that wherever you are collecting the data from, whatever institution it is that you're collecting data from, they are allowing you to do that study. So that's a site approval. So you have to obtain that and submit it with your application too. So when it comes to exempt, there are basically 8 categories of research that falls under exempt. And I'm not going to go over these because all these are listed on the form, exempt form, if you download it. Except this last 2, which are new editions of the revised common rule. So the forms we have currently online are based on the older version of the common rule, and we are still in the process of updating them. By fall, they should be updated. But in general, these are the 8 categories. So as long as your research classifies as any among these category, then you should be exempt. Otherwise, it will be an expedited. So that's kind of a good way of thinking. Instead of knowing when to submit exempt and when to submit expedited, just look at those categories. If they don't fall under these categories, then it's expedited. Yeah, it's an easier way to know that. Okay, so what I want to do, Okay, so that was exempt, but what is expedited or full? You'll see that the form for expedited and full application is the same. And expedited is basically research that involves very minimal risk, but nothing too serious. Nothing that, minimal risk meaning risk that you would just encounter in your day-to-day life, not anything drastic. And if it's something drastic, then it would go to be a full protocol. Full means, currently expedited and exempt protocols are reviewed by the chair. So it's me who reviews them. Full means that the entire committee sits, and I think we have about a member of 9 to 12, I think, members. So everybody in the committee reviews your application and they make a determination of how safe or unsafe, how risky and all that your research is. That's why it's called full, meaning full committee sits to review your application. So minimal risk, so you can think of it as like a tiered approach. No risk is exempt, minimal risk is expedited, more than minimal risk is full application. Okay, all right. So all these kind of research involving children or disabled or some kind of voice recordings that you're doing, or moderate exercise by healthy volunteers. Many of our researchers on campus use student athletes as their research subjects. So that kind of research falls under expedited. Non-manipulative or non-stressful research on group or individual behavior. All that classifies as expedited. It's just easier to follow my previous rule of thumb, right? If it's not exempt, just go look at the exempt categories. If it's not exempt, it has to be expedited full. Expedited or full. All right. So quickly, I just want to discuss if you open up, is it possible to open up the IRB form here?
It's possible. It may not look best, but we can try.
Okay, let's try. So all those forms are right here, exempt, expedited, and while we are here, adverse event reporting. So sometimes, once you start your research is when you realize that there are some adverse events occurring in your research process that you didn't think of previously. And as a result, you didn't put them in IRB. So now that they are occurring while you're collecting your data, what do? So you use this adverse event reporting form to basically update IRB that this is what is happening in my research. And the IRB basically looks at whatever is happening and makes a decision on whether it's safe, can you still go, or what should be the protocol in place. Okay, so this is the form that's used in the event something, an adverse event occurs, basically. Renewal is the form, so all expedited protocols, exempt have no expiry, but expedited and full protocols are only valid for 1 year. So after that year, if your research is still ongoing, then you need to submit the renewal form, okay? And revision form is when you already submitted an application, your IRB was approved, but then maybe after the pilot study, you decided to change your research design. So you basically need to submit a revision form specifying what have you changed in your research. All right, so that's why it's called you're basically making a revision to your research method. So you use that form. All right, and by the way, this is very important too. All applications need to be signed, And I've run into situations where students are experiencing a problem having their digital signature on the form. But if you go to this link here, it will show you exactly how to embed your digital signature. So you don't have to like print it out, sign it, and then scan it. You know, you can do it all in Adobe without having to sign. All right, so let's look at the exempt form. All right, so components of an IRB review. General purpose. So the first question is about what is the purpose of your research. So here you are posing the research question, basically, right? What's your research question? And I've noticed that I'm familiar with psychology literature somewhat, but for something like computer science or chemistry or, you know, I'm not that much familiar, but many applications involve technical jargon, and then I have to go look it up what this means. So it's best to kind of write this general purpose of the research and objective in a very simple, as if you're communicating to someone who does not know anything about your research, right? Just in a very simplistic manner. You can think of this part as like the abstract of your paper. You could actually just copy paste your abstract and put it in here, right? This helps us get a holistic, like a high level idea of what the research is about. Participants, so basically the second question is about describing who your participants are. So here, when I'm reviewing a study, I'm basically reviewing whether or not you are treating all your subjects equally. And remember the three principles. The last one was justice, that one group should not be reaping the benefit and the other group reaping the cost. So here, when you're describing the participants, I'm basically seeing whether you are biased towards any kind of a group. Right now, maybe the nature of your study may require that you study a particular population, right? But then even within that particular population, I'm basically examining whether, for example, let's say you might be looking at someone suffering from, let's say diabetes, for example, right? So your population is very particular, diabetic people, but then if all your participants are, let's say, like male, for example, now that's a biased population, right? So having a diabetic population is okay, but even within that population group, do you have equanimity? So that's what I'm looking for here. Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's say that you're setting up a study where you have two groups or even three groups, where the first group is your control, so they're not going to get any treatment.
Mm-hmm.
The second group is going to get treatment at level 1, and the third group is getting treatment at level 2.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the control group would never receive the treatment. Is that like going against the justice principle, or is that design okay?
So it depends on what kind of, what are you treating, right? If it's like something severe,
So let me just clarify that. So let's say the treatment is a tool to enhance your writing ability. Yeah?
okay,
And the
rating ability
to write more creatively or something like that.
Okay.
All right. So the control group does not get the tool. They never get to use the tool, and you're just using that to give them the rating task to see how their performance is.
Mm-hmm.
The guys in the other two groups, they get the treatment by different levels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like the level 2 group is expected to be more creative than the others.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be unjust to the guys in the control group?
I would not call it unjust because it's not like in the control group, it's not like just because they didn't get the treatment, you're not killing their creativity, right? If you are harming them in the process of not subjecting them to a treatment, if you are harming them, now that would be unjust. Make sense? Okay. So recruitment of participants kind of goes along the previous point, where I'm basically kind of seeing where are you. So sometimes researchers are recruiting from online sources, or they're posting ads or flyers. So if you're doing that kind of stuff, I need to see your flyers, all the recruiting material. IRB needs to see all your recruiting material, right? Compensation. Sometimes you may decide to compensate, and compensation doesn't have to necessarily be monetary, right? It could be like sometimes professors give students a credit for something on their quiz or whatever, right? So any compensation mechanism that you've decided needs to be written on the form. And it should be reasonable towards whatever the participant is doing, right? It shouldn't be such where they feel coerced into participating. Privacy and confidentiality. This is very important because people usually get mixed up here. If you see, I'm using two words here, privacy and confidentiality. Privacy has to do with the person. Confidentiality has to do with the data. Okay? So I could be collecting, let's say, some information about her, for example, right? And I tell her that, okay, if you fill out my survey, all your information is going to be kept private, and I'm not going to share it with anybody, right? And I'm not going to publish it. I have respected her privacy, okay? But the moment she fills the survey and she gives it to me, and then I look at the results, and then I call up someone and I say, oh, you know what, she wrote this XYZ, that is me violating her confidentiality of the data. Does that make sense? So in this question, where this question basically asks you, how are you going to keep the data, how are you going to maintain the privacy and keep the data confidential, right? You are basically describing both the aspects. How are you going to respect the person's right for privacy, and how you're going to keep the data secured, okay? Then comes the next question is about really describing how you're going to conduct your research. So the methodology. And once again, many people make a mistake of going too technical, right? And sometimes you have to go technical, right? But that's okay as long as you kind of provide the relevant references. So suppose you were adapting a survey scale from someone, right? Give me the source so that I can go and see what the original scale was and how you adapted it to your, and if that's okay or if that's risky, or so basically give me all the information, give IRB all the information needed to make a decision that your research design is sound. It's not risky, okay? Here you are describing all the risks, both short-term and long-term, and risks could be any kind. It could be a physical risk, it could be a psychological risk, an economic risk, any kind of risk that you feel. So sometimes, for example, I have research where people are asking about their children's tantrum behavior. I don't know, right? For example, just an example. So here you may not want to see the risk here could be something like mild discomfort to parents who are accepting that their children throw tantrums in public. I mean, it's not something that many parents would want to openly accept or anything, right? So there are mild risks. So, the best way to submit an IRB application is not from the perspective of a researcher. It's from the perspective of the participant. So you put on your participant hat and basically you write down everything. And if you as a researcher feels that you as a participant would not like something, then that means you should change something there. Maybe the risk is too high, or maybe if you're feeling uncomfortable, then you should assume the participants would also feel uncomfortable, so change that. So it's always best to fill out your IRB from the perspective of a participant as opposed to perspective of a researcher. Okay. Potential benefits. So basically here you are describing why are you doing the research? What benefit does it have to the society? Remember, it has to be generalizable knowledge, right? So how is it benefiting? And based on this question and that question, I determine the principle of beneficence. Are your risks outweighing the benefit? See? All right. Then some specifics. Sometimes it becomes, and I'm going to brush through now because we are over time, but just give me 5 more minutes. Come on. Okay, audio and video recording. Sometimes that's how you collect data, by observing someone. Especially many qualitative research is done by interviewing people. So you are collecting audio data. All that, and you will see all this is basically listed. If you're collecting audio and video data, what about that are you expected to report in an IRB? It's all there on the website. But there's a bunch of things that you need to submit to IRB. So you can look at that. Informed consent. There are 8 aspects to informed consent. Informed consent is used to inform the participant about the purpose of the research, what risk they are exposed to if they decide to participate, what are the benefits that they will gain, if there is any compensation, what they'll get, how you intend to treat their confidentiality and maintain their privacy, whom should they contact in the event if they have question, and very important is voluntary participation, meaning that, remember the first principle was the principle of autonomy. They have the decision-making ability, right? They decide whether they want to participate in your research or not. The researcher should not coerce in any kind. So here, basically, you're informing them that their participation is voluntary. And even if once they've begun the research, midway they decide to opt out, they can do so. So this is the layout, and it's all there on the website. This layout has to be this particular layout for expedited protocol or full protocol. For exempt, so this is the layout that HHS kind of laid out, right? For exempt is basically they are exempt from those federal regulations. So they don't have to follow the same protocol, same layout, but at least at the minimum, you should inform them that, their participation is voluntarily, they can opt out anytime, right? If there is a risk, it's your duty to inform them before they begin, right? So basically following those three principles. And there's actually a template for informed consent on the website, so you can just fill the template out. All these children's, prisoners, pregnant women, terminally ill, these are all considered as vulnerable population, so they all go under full protocol. Research with minors, anybody below 18 requires an assent form. So basically their legal guardians should give you the permission to use them as research subjects. Sometimes it's necessary to use deception in your research, whereby you don't want to tell your research participants what the purpose of your research is, because you want to get their first reaction to something, so deception becomes necessary. But in the event you're using deception, you have to let IRB know why, and why can't it be done without the deception, okay? And then this is, I've already told you, you can look up this document to see how to set up your digital signature, and that is it. Any question? I'm sorry I went 5 minutes over.
It's okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So if a researcher is doing a big study that comprises, let's say, about 2 or 3 individual experiments, does that come under one IRB application or
Is the purpose the same?
of the individual experiments?
Yeah, I mean the overall, do they all tie together to answer your research question?
Yes, it is.
Okay, then it should be one. And you're designing all of them at the same time?
That's the challenge, because the results from one experiment may inform
The
next
other one, okay. So in that case, what you want to do is in your IRB say that it's a 3-part experiment, and this is the first part. The first part will inform the second, and the second will inform the third. But the second and third are not yet designed right now. So what you can then do is, suppose everything is all okay, IRB issues you the protocol. When you're getting ready to do your second one, you submit a revision, and then the third one the same. Yeah.
When you are dealing with human subjects, I know that there is a human subject certification that I believe HHS provides.
Yes, and actually it's there on, it's called CITI training, CITI.
Yes, so then the question was, like, the person, does the primary investigator need to have the certification for performing?
It's not mandatory
Okay,
unless if your study is funded by an agency like NSF or NIH or some agency. Sometimes those agencies, the funding agencies, require the PI to complete training.
Okay.
But from FIT's side, we don't mandate that.
Okay.
But it's a good training to complete.
yes,
Yeah. And you can, it's there on the same form, that same link. You can scroll down and you could go to, I think the link is called Human Subject Research Training or something of that.
yes, it is,
Something
it is
of that.
provided online. I do
Yes.
have the certification, but I wondered whether or not it was something that was mandatory.
Yeah, not from FIT's side. Yeah.
Does the IRB publish any statistics on the volume that it processes?
We don't publish it, but Dr. Steelman, who was the ex-chair of IRB, I took over IRB just in fall last year. So it's actually not even been one whole year. But she had been the chair of IRB since 2004, and she kept all those statistics. And she actually showed me a graph one day where she, so this is time in years beginning 2004 till 2018 and research productivity, the number of protocols that were issued were on an increasing trend. Actually, I think they were more like that. So kind of like an exponential. Yeah. So it says something about the kind of that research is it's ongoing on FIT campus, and it's something valuable, you know. I deeply believe in it. Yeah. You grow by not knowing what you don't know, which is basically why you undertake research. You grow. So you grow by not knowing, kind of. It's, yeah. You know, people who don't do research will not understand that. Yeah. All right, any other questions? One more thing that I want to just say. So, suppose you already have completed a study, and after listening to this presentation, you are now thinking that I should have had an IRB in place. You can still submit an IRB. I will treat that as a secondary data source because you've already collected your data now. But it's always good to have an IRB approval rather than no approval at all. You know, some journals actually are starting to ask for an IRB approval. Yeah, so it's always a good thing to do first. Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, before you all leave, I just want to thank you again for coming and thank Dr. Patel as well. And I want to inform you that we have our next session coming up. It's going to be in March. The topic is going to be
March 5th, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be about posters, how to create effective and engaging posters. And we have two presenters that are going to be with us. We have Kathy Viegas from the Copy Center, and we also have Lorraine Ramirez, who's going to be delivering that presentation. So we look forward to seeing you guys on March 5th for our next activity. Thanks very much.